Quick announcement, guys. Tonight, 7:30 p.m. Eastern, I'll be doing my first live Q&A on Getter. I don't know if you're on Getter yet, but you should be. It's a terrific alternative platform. I enjoy posting on it and intend to do more with those guys. Now, coming up, Biden has a $30 million program to supply crack paraphernalia to the black community. And I'm going to argue that this is a kind of fitting metaphor for the relationship between the black underclass and the Democratic Party. Marina Hofman, a professor whose dad is a Canadian trucker, is going to join me. We're going to talk about the trucker revolt. I'm going to ponder the grim prospects of January 6 defendants whose trials are coming up, really starting in early April. And they're going to be held in Washington, D.C. That's not good. And I'm also going to talk about affirmative action and about Harvard, whose motto is Veritas, is actually lying through its teeth about the truth about racial differences in standardized testing. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
America needs this voice. The times are crazy. In a time of confusion, division, and lies, we need a brave voice of reason, understanding, and truth. This is the Dinesh D'Souza podcast.
Here's a headline that should get your attention. This is from Fox New York. Biden administration to fund programs to hand out crack pipes. This is a kind of headline. In fact, the Babylon Bee did a little post, and Kyle Mann from the Bee says, if one of my writers had pitched this headline, I'd have rejected it as being too absurd. But, well, it's not entirely absurd, as we're going to find out in a minute. So here's some detail from really a series of news reports. Apparently, the Biden administration is concerned about, quote, advancing racial equity. Racial equity in what? Apparently in drug consumption, in the consumption of illegal drugs. And they're thinking here, they refer to the opioid epidemic, but they're also talking about the crack cocaine and crystal meth epidemics. And apparently Biden's decided that one solution to this epidemic, what normal people would think you are promoting the epidemic, is to supply not just crack pipes, but the crack paraphernalia, the whole so-called kit. Now, think about this. If you bought a crack pipe with your own money and you started buying all this drug paraphernalia, that would be a crime. But for the government to do it is not a crime. It's apparently okay. And Jen Psaki was asked about this, the press secretary, and she goes, no, this is really misinformation. Our kit does contain a lot of paraphernalia for drug users, but it doesn't contain the actual crack pipe. So the White House is pushing back at the idea that they're kind of handing out the crack pipes. They do agree that they're handing out what they call safe smoking kits. This is an echo of the so-called safe sex kits of earlier decades. And apparently there's alcohol, swabs, and lip balm, and clean syringes and other material. So I don't think there's really any doubt here that the Biden administration is, in the name of combating drugs, actually promoting drugs. And evidently promoting drugs in minority communities, because it says, quote, applicants for the program get priority if they serve underserved communities. Who's an underserved community? African Americans, Native Americans, and LGBTQ people. Wow. With friends like these, who needs, enemies? If you are a minority group, if I was a member of one of these groups and I heard that they were distributing drug paraphernalia in my community, I would not be happy about it. Now, let's think here about what Trump was offering minority communities and what Biden is. Biden is essentially offering them crack paraphernalia. Trump offered them a platinum plan, so-called, $500 billion to create 40 black Wall Streets, to create investment communities in 40 cities, to bring entrepreneurship and economic empowerment to those communities. So is it any surprise that there are blacks for the first time, maybe the first time in years, if not decades, saying, you know what? I think I'll move over to the GOP. They're offering me a little bit of a better prospect to improve my life than to make me content with my misery. And this is the key point, that for me, this isn't just about crack paraphernalia. It's a metaphor for the parasitic relationship between minority underclasses, not just, well, of course, the black ghettos, but also Indian reservations, Latino barrios. Essentially, what the Democrats want to do is keep these populations inoculated, which is to say comatose, which is to say dependent, which is to say looking to the Democrats for another quick fix. And the Democrats will keep you in that state because they know that as long as you're in that state, they have you, they own you. You're, in a sense, their property. And I'm using that phrase with the full implications that it carries out. The party of slavery now has discovered a new way to create dependency and sustain it. This time not to steal the labor of these people, but to steal their votes. So the Democrats in this respect are acting true to form. And in looking at this program and looking at, despite all the qualifications, despite all the hedges, it's not this, it's that. Nevertheless, what we're seeing here is a fitting symbol for how Democrats view not just black people, but all minorities. Are you a MyPillow super shopper? Well, Debbie and I are, and Mike Lindell, the inventor and CEO of MyPillow, wants to make it easy for you to do that. How? By giving you great deals. For example, his Giza Dream bed sheets are 60% off. Wow, as low as $39.99. Time to stock up. Plus, with any purchase using promo code Dinesh, you'll get a free copy of Mike's book. He's also offering up to 66% off on other products. He's got more than 150 of them. The MyPillow robes, the MyPillow slippers, the MyPillow pajamas, and on it goes. All the MyPillow products, 60-day money-back guarantee, 10-year warranty. Call 800-876-0227. That number again, 800-876-0227, or go to mypillow.com to get the discounts. You got to use promo code DINESH, Dinesh. Guys, this issue of the trucker revolt, both in Canada and now even in the United States, a very important movement. And I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Dr. Marina Hofman. She is the author of a book called Women in the Bible. She's a professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University. But the reason she's on today is she is a Canadian. She is from the Toronto area. Her dad is a trucker. She's been very involved in and following the trucker movement. And hey, Marina, thanks for joining me. This is a remarkable development. Some people have commented, I have too, that this is the working class sort of revolt that the left has always predicted and called for. If you go all the way back to Marx, you know, the workers of the world unite. Well, the truckers are uniting. They're out on the road. They're making and this is also a grassroots movement. I can't name the head of the truckers, so it looks like this is developing from the bottom up. Talk a little bit about how did this movement get started and how did it grow? And then we'll talk about where it's going.
Right, so nearly 3 weeks ago now, 100 plus truckers left from British Columbia, the far coast on the west, and they wanted to have the mandates lifted for the truckers because, Dinesh, the truckers are working alone. They're not infecting anyone. But as they traveled across Canada, this movement picked up. Hundreds, thousands of vehicles joined them, thousands of Canadians, tens of thousands. The videos are overwhelming in terms of the numbers of Canadians that stood in the bitter cold waving them on. And by the time they got to Ottawa, Dinesh, their demands had not just been for themselves, but for every single Canadian. Freedom for every single Canadian before they'll leave.
Now, you mentioned, Marina, the mandates, and that's obviously probably the trigger that got this going. It's maybe the center of the truckers' demands. Do the truckers have an agenda that goes beyond the mandates, or is it essentially stop the mandates, open up the economy, let's have a little bit more normal life in Canada? What do the truckers want?
You know, mandates is kind of a political way of saying it, but Dinesh, they want their children to be free. They want their children to go to school every day, not have to suddenly cancel school again. They don't want their children masked. They don't want their teenagers shopping at a mall for the essentials only with their faces covered. They want freedom across the board. They want life to be back to normal, which everyone keeps talking about, but they have had enough and they've had it very hard for 2 years.
Now, I'm looking at, I saw a video yesterday and I was laughing when I saw it. It's Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau, and I'm going to quote him. He goes, "Individuals are trying to blockade our economy, our democracy, and our fellow citizens' daily lives. It has to stop." And I'm thinking, am I not looking at one such individual? You? Haven't you been blockading the economy? Haven't you been blockading democracy? Haven't you been blockading the citizens' lives? He's obviously referring to the truckers, but what struck me is the complete absence of self-consciousness. Here's a guy who obviously sees himself as a white knight. He's riding on a white horse. He's the good guy, and the truckers are the bad guys. Do you think that Trudeau and his administration's effort to demonize the truckers will succeed?
It's succeeded to an extent, and that's because the mainstream media says whatever Trudeau wants them to say. Not very different from here in America. And yet, the social media and all the videos that we've all seen, Dinesh, they can't be silenced anymore. Plus, you have the volume of Canadians. And I love that one by one, Canadians talking to each other are overcoming the lies and deceit that has gone all the way up to the Prime Minister.
Marina, from the American side, we have sort of this view that Canada is a lot more liberal than the United States, that the kind of rebellious spirit that bred the American Revolution is really not there in Canada, and therefore Canadians, like Australians or other Europeans, are more conformist, more easy to beat down. But now that we see this trucker revolt, isn't it true that there is that kind of fierce independent spirit in Canada as well? And that when you get out of Montreal and you get out of Toronto and Ottawa and you go into the vast expanse of Canada, most Canadians are fairly conservative.
Yes, Dinesh. And, we're passive for a reason. We're passive because we love peace. We'd rather not say something to offend someone and maybe put our friendship at risk. So there's a beautiful side to the passivity you see amongst Canadians. But now they're coming together in unity, and now peace means standing up to these mandates. So I don't think we've changed too much, Dinesh, but we've realized that the lie from the government that everyone has been double, triple vaccinated, and if you're not, you're just standing alone and you might as well be quiet. That lie has now clearly been shown, and people are standing together, whatever their medical history, and what a sense of love and peace on the streets. And Dinesh, I'm sure you've seen the videos of kids playing hockey on Ottawa. What could be more Canadian? So we haven't lost our identity yet.
I mean, I see the truckers are stopping and at places that offer them food. They're cleaning up the place. They're cleaning the bathrooms. In other words, this appears to be a responsible movement and not the kind of bad guy movement that it's being portrayed, certainly in certain parts of the media.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister has made accusations, but there's been no proof.
Yeah, do you think that this is a movement that is strong enough that it could actually pose a danger to the Trudeau government itself? Or do you think, because Trudeau has tried to make it look like, listen, not even most truckers support this movement. This is a minority movement. I think he used the phrase, it's a fringe movement. Well, if it's a fringe, it looks to me like a pretty big fringe. And my question to you is, do you think that this will have any enduring impact on the political configuration of Canada?
Well, I think a lot of Canadians that were Liberal voters all their life, and their parents were, and they just kind of bought the promise that the Liberals are for the people. They look at Trudeau and they don't see the Liberal leader that's for the people, and they don't see enough of the Liberal politicians standing up. Very few have stood up on side with the Canadians and the truckers. So I think that some of the assumptions people have made, Dinesh, about the Liberals have been untrue, and now that's finally coming to light.
Marina, let's close by me asking about your own family. Your dad was a trucker. What was it like growing up in a trucker family? And what is your dad's attitude now about the trucker revolt?
Well, Dinesh, like so many others, when all these mandates came out, he was nervous for his job. And he has a family. We're adult children now, but he still has to provide. He still has a mortgage like almost every other Canadian. So unfortunately, Dinesh, there was crippling fear amongst my dad and across all of Canada. How will they make the payments if they lose their job? And so it's not surprising that they finally took action to defend their very livelihood.
Marina Hofman, thank you very much for joining me. Very interesting perspective on a very important movement. Thank you again.
Thanks, Dinesh.
Some people just learn to live with aches and pains. When I think, for example, about my grandparents, for, years and years, they're like, oh, this hurts and that hurts. And they just took it as normal. But it's not normal and doesn't have to be normal. And now there's a 100% drug-free solution. It's called Relief Factor. Relief Factor supports your body's fight against inflammation, and inflammation is the source of aches and pains. The vast majority of people who try Relief Factor order more. Why? Because it works for them. Debbie's a true believer. She has frozen shoulder. She took Relief Factor. Pain went away, and she knows if she doesn't take it regularly, the pain's going to come right back. So Debbie's like, I'm not going to be without this again. Being able to lift her arm, exercise is super important to her. Relief Factor is the tool she needs. She's glad she's got it. Well, you too can benefit. Try it for yourself. You'll see. Order the 3-week quick start. Great price. It's only $19.95. Go to relieffactor.com or call 833-690-7246 to find out more about this offer. That number again, 833-690-7246, or go to relieffactor.com. You'll feel the difference. The first set of trials for January 6 defendants is coming up soon. Early April, I understand. And in some ways, this is good news. The January 6 defendants have been held, many of them, for months on end, in some cases well over a year. Rand Paul recently was on Fox, and he goes, it's ridiculous to keep people confined like this. People have a right to a speedy trial. They have rights to due process. These rights are being abrogated. And he says, quote, to abandon those principles for political purposes is to abandon the very bedrock of American jurisprudence. Well, I think it's fair to say that the left has done that. Now, I myself have said that it's a good thing to take some of these cases to trial for the obvious reason that it allows you to put the government itself on trial, to bring out the actions of the police and the government on January 6th. And this is something the January 6th Pelosi committee has been trying to conceal. They're sort of looking over here so you don't look over there. And a trial is a good mechanism to bring this information out. But in a recent article, Julie Kelly makes the point, and this is a very valid point, that this is a risky business because these trials are going to be held where? In Washington, D.C. Now, the point here is this. These January 6 defendants have already suffered the wrath of the D.C. judges. And by the way, even the Republican judges in D.C. become part of the swamp. They live in the swamp. They go to cocktail parties in the swamp. Their friends are swamp rats. And so they tend to absorb a kind of swamp mentality. And the people who live in D.C. no different. Now, the idea here is that they become financially dependent, career dependent on the government, on the trough, on the swamp, as we call it. And so, as a result, it becomes very much part of their psychology. Here's Amit Mehta, Obama appointee, talking about January 6 defendants, and he says, quote, they told lies, they told falsehoods, they told our election was stolen when it clearly was not. Ha 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 ha. This is a topic that I'll be addressing at some point shortly. But nevertheless, D.C. is a place where 94% of the population voted for Biden. So it's no surprise that a number of the D.C. The lawyers for the January 6 defendants are like, listen, we demand a change of venue. We want to move these trials elsewhere because we are facing a hostile population, and the jury is going to be chosen from that population. So this is not really a jury of your peers. This is a jury that is very partisan for the most part, and one that kind of has, you may say, deep prejudices about how to think about January 6th. Now, when this motion was made before Judge Mehta, he's like, no way, I'm not going to move the trial. The jury can be fair. But Julie Kelly makes some key points here, which I think are worth noting. Number one, most of the potential jurors get all their information about January 6th from the DC media, and there's been a nonstop loop of hostile coverage that make these people seem not merely like people who are, quote, election deniers, but as domestic terrorists, as people who have posed the greatest danger to the Capitol since 1812, insurrectionists, and so on. Now, There was a survey conducted by Zogby that looks at the attitudes of DC residents, and apparently 74% of them believe that anybody who was inside the Capitol on January 6th should be convicted of insurrection. Think about this. Almost no one is charged with insurrection, but they should all be convicted of insurrection. And that would mean years and years and years in prison. 64% believe that even if someone did not commit a crime of violence, that defendant should still be held responsible for what other people did. Wow. I mean, talk about throwing out the simple idea that you're responsible in a court of law and in a system of justice for what you did, not what other people did. In one of the filings, one of the defense attorneys showed a comparison of attitudes between DC and Atlanta. And he picked DC and Atlanta because they have similar populations. They have a sort of a 50-50 black-white population. And yet in Atlanta, it's very interesting because while most DC residents consider January 6 protesters, quote, conspiracy theorists, most Atlanta residents don't. 76% of DC residents say that January 6 was an insurrection, but only 55% of Atlanta residents do. Again, when you're talking about are they criminals, are they white supremacists, you find sharp differences between DC and Atlanta, simply showing that there is a particular ideological complexion to Washington, DC. Now, the reason I think these judges want to have these trials in D.C. is they don't want what you could call the Kenosha problem. What's the Kenosha problem? You have a jury of your peers. They look at the evidence. They look at what Kyle Rittenhouse did. They listen to the lying detective who goes, oh, no, those Antifa guys were just running in the same direction. They weren't chasing Kyle Rittenhouse. And the jury goes, nah, we kind of see them chasing Kyle Rittenhouse. We see him kind of responding to people who actually posed a threat. So that's what I call the Kenosha problem from the left's point of view, a fair jury that exonerates the Rittenhouse, or in this case, exonerates January 6 defendants by saying, listen, compare when you apply an even-handed standard of justice, what you did compared to what the left is doing is a big fat nothing. Go home. You've already been incarcerated long enough. What the left really wants for January 6th is you could call it a Derek Chauvin verdict, almost a foregone conclusion, a verdict in which the jury is biased, the system is sort of set up in such a way that a fair assessment of what the defendant did is difficult, if not impossible. And that is, I wouldn't say that's the norm in every court case in America today, but that is now a feature, a staple, a regrettable staple of American justice. If you could see and taste the steak or salmon from moinkbox.com, you would order it right now. For now, I'm kind of seeing it in my mind and tasting it. It's delicious. And I'm telling you, you've got to get moinkbox.com. Moink delivers grass-fed and grass-finished beef and lamb, pastured pork and chicken, and wild-caught Alaskan salmon direct to your door. In the process, they help family farms become financially independent outside of big agriculture. Moink meat is so delicious. I love it. You will too. Get moinked right now. Join the Moink movement today. Go to moinkbox.com/Dinesh, and listeners to this show will get free filet mignon for a year. What? That's 1 year of the best filet mignon you'll ever taste, but for a limited time. It's spelled MOINK box.com/Dinesh. That's moinkbox.com/Dinesh. Americans seem somewhat divided in their views about China. And I would say that conservatives are also somewhat divided on this subject. There is one faction that believes that China is a grave danger to American security. And then there's another faction, I would call this more libertarian leaning, that sees China as just another power trying to secure its own interess. That can benefit America in certain ways, let's say through trade, but at the same time should be watched for its hostile military intentions. And conservatives are spread out across the spectrum of views between these two extremes on how they view China. Now, there's a interesting article on China in the magazine Foreign Affairs, a magazine that was once, for me, indispensable reading. This is in my old think tank days. And then I noticed that it was becoming a little bit predictably left-wing. And so I am now only a periodic reader of it, but every now and then it has a really good article. And here's a pretty good one Xi Jinping's New World Order by Elizabeth Economy, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution, my old alma mater, if you will. And this article talks about how China views the world. And it tries to see America through Chinese eyes, a kind of shift. Instead of looking at how we view China, how does China view us? And it makes a real effort. It's not easy to do that, by the way, particularly for an American observer. But this article does make an effort to do that. And it begins by saying that China takes the view that for most of human history, the Chinese were dominant. They were the leading power in the world. And the West became dominant starting around the year 1500. So for, you can say, half a millennium, for 500 years. And the Chinese view is 500 years is a long time. At least it's a long time from the point of view of, let's say, a single lifetime. It's, let's just say, maybe 10 generations. But even 10 generations is not that much in the sweep of human history. What about the world before 1500? Now, I think it is fair to say that if we lived in the year 1500 and we looked around the world, we would in fact conclude most likely that the most dominant country in the world, the most dominant kingdom, if you will, was China. And dominant how? Dominant in wealth, in power, in exploration, in what we now call science. Dominant really in pretty much every respect. Dominant in landmass, dominant in the power it exercised over its neighbors and its ability to project influence. The second most influential civilization in the year 1500 was the Arab Islamic world. But the Arab Islamic world was not unified. Of course, there was already a split between the Shia and the Sunni, but there were also multiple Islamic dynasties. There was one, probably the main one, based in Turkey, Constantinople, then called now Istanbul. But there were also Islamic regimes in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Damascus, and so on. And so you had multiple Islamic empires. India was a powerful kingdom or set of kingdoms. India was then ruled by a series of Hindu princes. And there were, in the north of India, some Muslim influences. So you had China, you had the Arab Islamic world, you had India, and Western civilization was, at that point, a little bit of a backwater. Europe was a little bit of a backwater. London and Paris were nothing more than medium-sized towns. Of course, America had just barely been discovered. Columbus had just gotten to American shores and not even to the landmass we call the United States. So it's really difficult to imagine the world in 1500. But the point I'm trying to make here is that going back from that time 1,000 years, the Chinese were, you may say, on top of the world. And so the premise of this article, I haven't even got to the article yet, but the premise of the article is that China believes that they are the natural rulers of the universe, that there was a kind of unfortunate historical blip by which, using technology and using a certain set of internal devices that became available to the West, not just the Renaissance, but the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, later the Industrial Revolution, Western civilization became dominant and took over the world. But let's think about all those things. The ideas of the Enlightenment are now available globally. Certainly, there are very good Chinese scientists, there are very good Chinese people who deal with investments and stocks. And so the Chinese are able to learn and absorb the techniques that brought the West to its current level of influence. And the Chinese point is we have now learned how to play the game even better. We've devised a formula for which, while the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries and all the way to the present have belonged to the West. And by the way, within the West, you've had shifting power. The 15th century, you could say, belonged to the Portuguese, the 16th century to the Spanish, the 17th century to the French, the 18th and 19th to the English, the 20th century and early 21st has been the American century. But the Chinese view is that game over. The Chinese view is that from now on, it's going to be the Chinese century again and again and again, as far as the eye can see. I think we all know that in order to keep our immune system strong, we need extra protection for it. Now, my friends at Centurion Labs have combined 5 key ingredients to defend your immune system against allergies, colds, the flu, and even coronavirus. It's called Centurion Defender, and it incorporates vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, copper, and quercetin in just 1 capsule. No more swallowing 10 pills a day or not taking supplements because the individual cost is too high. Debbie and I currently take just 1 Defender with breakfast and 1 Defender with dinner, and this definitely keeps the germaphobe in our family happy. Just like the Centurions of Rome led by example and held themselves to the highest possible standards, Centurion Labs has dedicated the last 15 years to research and develop safe, effective, and affordable healthcare products made in the USA that you can trust. For a limited time, listeners of this podcast can save 20% off their first order of Centurion Defender when you visit centurionlabs.com/Dinesh. Defend your health today with Centurion Defender. Go to CENTURION, centurionlabs.com/Dinesh, centurionlabs.com/Dinesh. I'm discussing the global aspirations of China as reflected in an article in Foreign Affairs by Elizabeth Economy that is called Xi Jinping's New World Order. And according to this article, China is now ready to move to shift the balance of power around the world. In fact, the Chinese view, says the author, is that America is no longer a world power. America has claimed, by the way, since World War II, to be one of the, quote, superpowers. And once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991-92, many people have described the United States as a unipolar power or as the sole superpower. Well, the Chinese view is more dismissive. It is that America is, let's call it, an Atlantic power. In other words, the world is divided into big regions. And the Atlantic Ocean defines one of those regions. And in that domain, yes, America does have a lot of power, but the Chinese view is nowhere else. The rest of the world doesn't really belong to America, certainly not Asia. And so China's view is America should now and is now retreating to becoming what it was at the beginning, an Atlantic power. China, by contrast, is not merely an Asian power, but a world power. So what we see here is not that China is saying, let's move to a multipolar world. You have your sphere of influence. We have our sphere of influence. No, the Chinese view is we've got a system that will displace you. You become a regional power the way we have been. We'll become a world power the way you used to be. How? How are the Chinese going to do that? Well, really part of the way they're doing it is through a kind of worldwide infrastructure system. Their idea is we're going to be the builders of the whole world. We're going to build the world's ports, the world's railways. We're going to install the world's fiber optic systems. We're going to establish electronic payment systems, satellites. We're going to lead the world in the 21st century. We're going to create, let's call it a China-centric world order to replace the kind of Pax Americana, the world order established by the United States in the aftermath of World War II. And the main difference between the sort of Pax Americana, which was the idea of having a variety of states coming together through, for example, international institutions like the UN, the China view is no, we're going to have a single all-powerful Chinese state led by the Chinese Communist Party, and all dictation of how the world is going to be organized, or all leverage in how the world is going to be organized, is going to come from this centralized source. Now, China, of course, begins by defining its interests around itself. Essentially, what they're saying is Hong Kong is ours, the South China Sea is ours, Taiwan is ours, and China is moving to make that happen. Hong Kong is already inside the Chinese orbit. It's essentially become another Chinese city. And the Chinese say that no Chinese map is complete without including Taiwan. And what's the United States going to do about it? Now, there's been, of course, some pushback from the United States, seeing that China is increasing its military presence, its presence in the South China Sea. The United States has created a sort of Asian alliance with Australia, India, and Japan. And the idea is that, and this I think is the right thing to do, that there's going to be a countervailing force to check the growing power of China. But China believes that long term, it's going to win out. It's going to win out because it can buy off even these Asian powers. Australia, for example, is a major receptacle of Chinese investment. The Chinese don't get along too well with the Indians and not so well with the Japanese either. But essentially, the Chinese want to create trade zones in which, which are even better than the old trade systems created, for example, by the World Bank. When the World Bank tried to promote development in countries, it would give you a loan and say, listen, you go do your own development. Here's the loan. You try to pay us back. And many times the countries were like, well, we don't know how to pay you back. But the Chinese operate differently. Their point is, listen, not just are we going to give you loans, we're going to come over there and build your roads. We're going to be a one-stop shop. Not only are we going to supply the labor and materials, we'll supply the financing, we'll supply the insurance, we'll supply the security protection. And so China's idea is to move into these countries and establish zones of influence. They are the ones who want to build the railroads and the bridges, the fiber optic cables, the 5G networks, the ports. And the Chinese are doing this. I mean, this is not a plan that the Chinese have unfurled. They're doing it in countries like Pakistan. They're doing it in Greece, where they built the port of Piraeus. They're doing it in places like Ethiopia, South Africa, the Sudan. In fact, they have established themselves so powerfully in some of these countries in Africa that they are supplying even propaganda training to the leaders of those countries in Communist Party rhetoric, Communist Party ideology, and Communist Party systems of control. In other words, what the Chinese are trying to say is that our communist system doesn't just have to be in China. You can have it in Africa. You can have it in Venezuela. You can have it elsewhere, and we'll train you leaders so that you can sort of subjugate your populations in precisely the way that we do. There's no question that China has become if not a global superpower already, very close to being that. And if not a military superpower, very close to being that. And for this reason, I think we should, at a time, by the way, when America is confused, America's divided, America's having a lot of internal problems, this is not the time that we need a menacing adversary on the world stage. But whether we need it or want it, here it is. I like to do research on my sponsors, and I only recommend brands to my listeners that I believe in. I can say with full confidence that ExpressVPN is the best VPN on the market. Here's why. ExpressVPN doesn't log your activity online. Lots of cheap or free VPNs make money by selling your data to advertisers. ExpressVPN doesn't do this. They even developed a technology trusted server that makes their VPN servers incapable of storing any data at all. ExpressVPN now uses Lightway, a new VPN protocol they engineered to make user speeds faster than ever. This makes ExpressVPN blazing fast and lets me stream videos in HD quality with zero buffering. ExpressVPN is also easy to use. Just fire up the app, tap one button to connect, that's it. And it's not just me saying this. Business Insider, The Verge, many other tech journals rate ExpressVPN the #1 VPN in the world. So protect yourself with the VPN that I use and trust. Use my link expressvpn.com/Dinesh today and get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's expressvpn.com/Dinesh, expressvpn.com/Dinesh. The Supreme Court is hearing the affirmative action case involving Harvard University and the University of North Carolina. And the issue is that these schools, and by the way, they're just representative of schools across the country, have been systematically discriminating against white and Asian American students and in favor of Black and Latino students. And this has been going on now for a generation. It's going on quote, in the name of diversity, even though really diversity has nothing to do with it. And what I mean by that is that this is not about importing a wider range of views to campus. Campuses have a less wide range of views today than they did 40 years ago. When I was a student, there were all kinds of topics that were ordinarily discussable, and even if the tilt was liberal, nevertheless, you could talk about subjects generally uninhibited. And now that's simply not the case. So what campuses have produced is ideological homogeneity. But nevertheless, they have been engaging in these vigorous forms of discrimination. And I want to highlight a study from the Brookings Institution, by the way, a left-leaning think tank, which gets to the root of the matter of why they're doing this. And why they're doing this has to do with massive differences in academic preparation and academic performance between racial groups. I want to emphasize that these are ethnic differences in performance. They're not socioeconomic differences. In other words, we're not seeing these differences solely because some applicants come from poor families and some applicants come from upper middle class families. No, we're talking about differences between ethnic groups, even when you control for socioeconomic factors. Now let's look at this so we can get a clear-eyed view of what the problem is. And this, you'll understand here why this whole secretive system of affirmative action has been implemented. It's to hide the facts I'm about to disclose. Now, the Brookings Institution looked at College Board data for 1.7 million college-bound seniors in 2015. You're asking why they're using 2015 data. They're using the data because it takes a while for the data to be sorted out, to be able to look for all the variables that you're trying to look for. Now, let me give you some telling facts. The mean score, and we're looking here at the math section of the SAT for a reason I want to mention. If you look at the verbal section of the SAT, it's very easy to say, well, the verbal section is, it's culturally biased because they're asking you questions about, tennis and golf clubs. First of all, that's nonsense. The verbal section of the SAT doesn't do that. They're very careful not to invoke, you can call it culturally biased or privileged terms. In fact, there's more discussion of Black writers and Latino writers and Native American writers on the verbal section. But let's leave it aside because it's very hard to argue. Let's focus on the math section because it's really hard to argue that, a math problem is racially biased or equations are rigged against Hispanics. I mean, this is absurd. Now, on the math section of the SAT in 2015, the mean score, the average score, is 511 out of 800, which I have to say is a pretty low score. But nevertheless, that's the average score. Now, the average score for whites is 534. So it's measurably, but only slightly above the mean. For Asians, 598. Now that's a more significant difference. Asians are scoring, about 80 points above the mean. For blacks, 428. Now think of it, that's about 80 points below the mean. And for Latinos, a little bit higher than blacks, 457. So these are, and the article doesn't hesitate to call them, racial gaps on the SAT. Now, the SAT scores can be plotted on a bell curve, and you've seen these bell curves in which the averages are clustered toward the middle. But when you get out to the tails of the curves, the far ends, basically you see the very strong students at one end and the very weak students at the other. These are the two tails of the bell curve. And when you go to the tail, these differences between groups become even more exaggerated. So let's take a look. We're now looking at top scorers, people scoring between 750 and 800. Now, you need this kind of score to get into the top universities in the country, not just the Ivy League, but you want to get into Stanford, Berkeley, Williams College, Oberlin. This is the range you need to be in. When you look at those scores, 60% of the people who get those scores are Asian American. 33% of people who get those scores are white. Think about it. Add the Asian Americans and the whites, and you're already at 93%. What does that mean? That all the Black and Hispanic top scorers added up come up to 7%. It's essentially 5% Latino and 2% Black. Wow. Now, let's go to the bottom end of the spectrum. These are basically, It's kind of mean to use this term, but these are the stupidest applicants in the country. These are people who score between 300, and if I'm not mistaken, you get 200 points just for taking the test. You get 200 for showing up. So you have to get almost all the questions wrong to get 300 out of 800. Well, if we're looking at students scoring between 300 and 350, out of those students, only 6% are Asian, 21% are white, 35% are black, 37% are Latino. Now, when you look at these figures, you've got to remember that the majority of applicants are white. And so you see blacks and Hispanics clustered heavily among the people getting, well, the worst scores. In the entire country, the Brookings study points out, there were at most 2,200 black and 4,900 Latino test takers who scored over 700 in the United States. In comparison, 48,000 whites and 52,800 Asians scored that high. So you see what's going on here? Universities who want to take top students have their pick of the white students and the Asian students, but there are very few black students at that level of competence to go around. And so universities go, if we want to have 8, 10, 12% of blacks, well, simply, you have to dig deeper into the bottom of the barrel. You've got to start taking students who are, well, at the very mediocre, below mediocre, super dumb, and nevertheless you take them. Why? Because you don't really care about those students. You don't care if they drop out. You don't care if they fail. Your goal is basically to pad the numbers to be able to say, oh, we have a freshman class with, that looks like America. It might look like America, but hidden behind that are these massive cognitive differences of not academic IQ, but academic preparation and academic achievement. And so this is the problem that the Supreme Court is dealing with. Should universities, in the name of racial posturing, be able to take much weaker, academically weaker from the point of view of extracurriculars, Hispanic and black students and admit them and turn away better qualified white students and Asian students? I say absolutely not, and I think this is what the Supreme Court will decide. But Harvard and UNC and all these other colleges, kicking and screaming, are trying to defend this system, which I think is, from a moral point of view, from a legal point of view, completely indefensible. Ronald Reagan saw it 40 years ago, massive inflation that we haven't seen since then, well, until today. Now, in Reagan's words, inflation is as violent as a mugger, as frightening as an armed robber, and as deadly as a hitman. Now, right now, your retirement accounts are under attack thanks to the inflationary policies of this administration. If you have not yet called Birch Gold, the only people I trust, to help you diversify your 401ks or IRAs into gold, well, then you're missing the boat. You're treading water without a life vest. Birch Gold has your life vest. Let them help you convert an IRA or 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold. With thousands of satisfied customers and A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, you can trust Birch Gold to protect your savings. Text Dinesh to 989898 to get a free information kit on gold. Reagan knew the biggest threat to our wealth. Protect yours now. Text Dinesh to 989898 and get your free information kit on gold now. As those of you who listen and watch the podcast regularly know, toward the end of the podcast, I tend to veer into sometimes the realm of the bizarre. And today I want to discuss a rather unusual subject. I think all of you will find it somewhat unusual. What is the point of a fly? And yes, I'm talking about the flies that buzz around. What good are flies? And to put this in a theological framework, why would God make a fly? Now, I realize when I pose questions like this that they are somewhat anthropocentric, which means they're coming from the human point of view. After all, if flies could talk, they may be saying, what's the point of a human? What good are humans? Why did God waste his time and make these humans? So there's more than one way to look at this. But, if you look at the book of Genesis, it does say that God made the world and sort of for the benefit of man. God made the animals, and that includes flies, for us. And sometimes that's a little hard to believe that nature and nature's creation is for our sake, because some of nature seems very hostile, right? We have earthquakes, we have tornadoes, we have viruses, we have bacteria. So how can one defend the idea that these creatures are somehow necessary and beneficial to God's supposedly favored creature, namely Homo sapiens? Of all the unnecessary creatures in the world, of all the annoying, pesky, we can do without this creatures in the world, I think at the top of the list you'd have to put the fly. The fly is simply unexplainable. And this is all a background to an article that I just read in the New York Review of Books, which is called Flies Like Us. And that title can be taken more than one way, but it really it provides some fascinating details about flies. For example, it points out that there are 160,000 known species of flies. And by the way, there are just a lot of flies on the earth. There are 200 million flies for every human being on the planet right now. I can do the math in my head, but I don't need to. 7 billion people on Earth, multiply that by 200 million. That's how many flies there are. And flies are actually quite diverse. Some flies lay eggs. We think of flies as laying eggs and then out comes a little fly. But some flies actually give birth directly to their young. And a mosquito is actually a fly. A mosquito is a particular type of, call it a blood-sucking type of fly. Now, the article goes on to point out that flies actually do some useful things that most people are really not aware of. One useful thing that they do is apparently waste removal. Now, this seems kind of weird, but you've seen it. I mean, you see a dead animal, and what's the dead animal covered by? Maggots, flies. And what are those flies actually doing? They're actually cleaning the animal up. And what I mean by that is that they're consuming this dead flesh, and they're removing the deadly bacteria that are in the dead flesh that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. Over a lifetime, says the author of this article, the average American produces, and this is a little gross, 25,000 pounds of poop. You know this? That's the average American. I'm probably a lot below that, but I guess that's the average. There's probably people who do a lot more. That's how we get to the average. And but apparently there's
that means they have a really good gut because
they have a really healthy gut, says Debbie. Yeah.
Yes,
Well, evidently, we have to be grateful for poop-eating flies, of which there are many. And admittedly, I wouldn't want to be a poop-eating fly, but I can recognize the usefulness of poop-eating flies that, again, help with waste removal. Flies also, by the way, pollinate flowers. Now, I didn't know this. I always thought, bees pollinate flowers. But apparently, flies are the greatest pollinators of flowers. And so without flies, you wouldn't have all these great pollinating plants, the cacao, the jackfruit, and many other types of beautiful flowers. And here's the latest and kind of interesting twist, which is now dependent on modern medicine. Flies have now become a critical tool of forensic analysis. Now, Debbie and I have watched a lot of episodes. Debbie, all episodes? Pretty much every episode. Well, over time, we used to watch a little bit every day, and forensic files. And so what flies do is they feed off dead humans, and they do it on a schedule. And so since they eat on a schedule, by looking at the flies that are around the carcass, you can determine things like the time of death. When was this person actually killed? And so flies are now part of the forensic, you may say, toolkit. And finally, the fruit fly, you probably know this, has been a subject of study, of scientific study, for now many, many decades. In fact, scientists create fruit flies in the lab. And when I say create flies, nobody knows how to make a fly out of nothing or just out of chemicals. But what they do is they genetically manipulate fruit flies to better understand diseases. And so you've got scientific advances coming about because of the fly. So I think this is all a way of saying, and in some of my books I've talked about applying the same kind of analysis to things like earthquakes and tornadoes, things that seem not only pointless but destructive. But when you look more closely, you realize that not only do they make the world go better, but in some cases, you couldn't even have a world. You couldn't even have a world that is habitable for life and especially for human life without these things. And so reading this article gave me a newfound appreciation for that most pesky of creatures, the fly.
Subscribe to the Dinesh D'Souza podcast on Apple, Google, and Spotify, or watch on Rumble, YouTube, and SalemNow.com.